PseudoPod is extruded into this universe from a dimension of purest fear. It's beautiful in its own alien way, but what's to come will unsettle you. PseudoPod, episode 669, October 11th, 2019. This week's story, Zanders the Magnificent by Annie Neugebauer. Hello everyone, welcome to PseudoPod, the weekly horror podcast. I'm Alistair, your host, and this week's story, which comes to us from Annie Neugebauer, was first published in Fireside Magazine, issue 21 in March 2015. Your reader for this story is the incomparable John Paget, and for reasons which will become apparent quite early on in this, for those of you who've listened for a while, this is one of my favourite. I'm just going to jump straight into it, but not before reassuring you all, of course, that I have a story for you, and I promise you, it's true.
Zanders the Magnificent by Annie Neugebauer. Narrated by John Paget. "My handsome, darling boys," Mrs. Zander said, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. "Which one of you wants to be alive today?" Robbie and Bobby turned their heads inward at the same time, staring at each other with identical dark eyes. Bobby blinked, followed shortly by Robbie's blink, and they both said, "Bobby, Robbie was alive yesterday." Mrs. Zander nodded approvingly, clapping her hands against their shoulder blades. "Good, yes. I like it when you agree," she said. "Now both of you go get Bobby ready for school." The boys lurched into a sprint together, their narrow shoulders brushing past the door frame at the same time, their synced footsteps thumping down the hall. When they were safely within their bedroom, Bobby shut the door. Robbie went and flopped on the left bed, indistinguishable from the right bed in everything but placement in the room, and sighed. "I wish it was Saturday so we could both live," he said, covering his face with his arms. "I know," Bobby agreed. They weren't supposed to be talking like this, and Robbie was supposed to be getting ready at the same time as Bobby, but their mother probably wouldn't check in on them so soon. "You'll tell me everything?" Robbie prompted. Bobby pulled on a red and white striped shirt. Once his messy hair poked through, he shook his head like a duck ruffling its feathers. Robbie never noticed that before. He tucked it into memory to practice later. Bobby grabbed the matching red and white striped shirt out of Robbie's drawer and tossed it to him on the bed, his silent urge to get up and get ready. "Of course," he said. "I always tell you everything." Finally, Robbie stood, pulling the shirt over his head and settling his hair like a duck. The door opened, and Mrs. Zander's eyes raked over them. "What are you doing?" she snapped. Robbie's eyes dropped to his pajama pants. Bobby already had his jeans on. "Sorry, Mama," they said simultaneously. There was a scramble as Robbie rushed to change pants, and Bobby tried to decide whether to take his back off to mimic Robbie or wait for him to catch up. "This will take more dedication than that," Mrs. Zander scolded them. "Didn't you learn anything from your father?" The boys looked down at the ground, and Mrs. Zander huffed and walked out, leaving the door open behind her. Robbie put his hands over his face. Bobby mirrored him. Mrs. Zander sat in the rocker as Robbie watched out the blinds. Bobby walked down the sidewalk to the bus stop. Robbie's feet stepped in place with his twins. His hands rose to adjust an invisible backpack when Bobby adjusted his. Mrs. Zander let out a strangled sob, and Robbie turned. "Don't cry, Mama." She sniffed and held out her arms, and Robbie climbed into her lap. She wrapped him in a tight hug. "I'm just so sorry that you can't both be alive today," she said into his hair. Robbie's hand patted her arm as his ear pressed to her chest for her heartbeat. Unlike when he could hear Bobby's, he did not try to match his heart to hers. "So sorry that both of my boys can't yet stun the world with their splendor." Robbie heard her crying quiet, and then she was chuckling. "But it will be the most magnificent trick," she said. "It will be the most magnificent trick, my darling. It will all be worth it." She began humming, deep within her chest, and the chair rocked back and forth, back and forth. "So you will stay home with your mother today. You will be dead, and we'll have a marvelous time." Robbie, Bobby, and Mrs. Zander were all in the practice room. Robbie and Bobby stood on either side of the stage, and Mrs. Zander lounged in a seat at the back of the room, the knitting forgotten on her lap. The boys were practicing the mouse trick, although now they were just using golf balls. Robbie lifted his cape with one hand, raising the wand in the other. A fraction of a moment later, Bobby's flowed out as well, but Mrs. Zander interrupted. "Timing, boys! Timing! Bobby! You must start precisely when Robbie does, and both of you must use more drama in your movements. Remember your father's stage presence and work towards his proficiency. You must master that before we can learn the truly show-stopping tricks. To impress today's audiences, it must be something new, something edgy." Robbie scratched his cheek. Bobby scratched his cheek. Mrs. Zander frowned. Again. This time both capes swept out simultaneously, like black wings lined in blood. "I am Zanders the Magnificent," they declared as one. Their capes stayed extended on one side as the support arms snapped into place, making it appear as if they were still holding them up. "Welcome to the show." Each reached down on cue to retrieve the golf ball mouse from the clear plexiglass box. Bobby's fingers snuck in as quickly and furtively as a mouse itself, as did Robbie's. But on the way out, Robbie messed up. The lid to the box snapped shut on the tip of his fingers with a violent crack. Robbie howled in pain. He jerked his hand out, and as he did so, he screamed louder, dropping his wand to hold the brilliantly red fingers up in front of him. His mouth formed a perfect oval bordered by his small teeth. Bobby looked anxiously at Mrs. Zander. "Bobby," she said sternly. His face flushed. "But, Mama—" "Robert Zander, don't make me come up there." Bobby gritted his teeth together, sliding his trembling hand back into the box. A loud crack, and Bobby began to wail as well. He dropped his wand and held up his own red fingers, forming his mouth into a perfect oval. Mrs. Zander stood and set her knitting on the seat before she walked up to the stage. She swatted Bobby firmly on the butt. "That's for hesitating," she said. Then she swatted Robbie, too, because she would never spank one and not the other. "You must both be more disciplined," she scolded. "Think of your father and how disciplined he was, and even that was not enough. You must never forget what he went through. You must always remember that it is life and death on the stage. You must give the people what they want." Their yelling began to simmer into hiccuping sobs, each casting looks out of the corner of his eyes to get the timing right. "Now come on, my sweet boys," Mrs. Zander said. "Let's tend to those slow little fingers." She drew them both to her and led them out of the room. "Let's make sure those hands are fixed up good." In the empty practice stage, glowing under the lights, the two white practice mice sat in the identical corners of their identical clear boxes, dead as golf balls. As Mrs. Zander sat in her rocker and did her knitting, she imagined what the boys would look like at their first public show when they were all grown up, even more famous than their father. With no paper record to prove their dual existence, their tricks would fool even other master magicians. They would become a worldwide sensation. As Robbie walked down the sidewalk to the bus, he longed to have his brother at his side. He imagined how many other people on the planet might be dead. As Bobby watched him from the window, walking in place, he longed to be at his brother's side. He imagined what it might be like to be alive every single day. Ladies and gentlemen, you are in for a treat. Tonight is a debut performance of the son of legendary escape artist Robert Zander, who, as some of you remember, met his tragic end over 2 decades ago during the stunt that is now known as the Chamber of Death. But thankfully for the world of magic, he has left a son to carry on his great name. May I introduce to you the one, the only, Zanders the Magnificent! Applause exploded through the room. Bobby, all grown up, dashed onto the stage, tall and lean, with his black cape billowing behind him. When he stepped into the spotlight, the red and white sequins on his shirt sparkled and winked at the dark, packed audience. In the front row sat Mrs. Zander, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes alight with a strange glow. Backstage, Robbie watched, hidden in the black curtains, his lips ghosting the shapes of Bobby's words, his arms sketching phantom movements. "Welcome," he intoned in a deep voice, "to the most magnificent show you will ever see." The crowd grew hushed, and he sent his words out like sleek promises through the shadows of the room. "Tonight, I bring you wonder." He took a deep bow, extending his cape out behind him with both arms, and when he stood back up, he held a long-stemmed red rose between his teeth. The crowd hummed. "Danger." He tossed it out over the seating, and in midair the rose changed to a cluster of scarlet streamers, falling like fireworks over the audience. The crowd oohed. "And possibly even death." He swept his arms in and back out, and the lining of his cape had changed from black to glistening red. The crowd gasped. "But one thing is for certain. By the end of the evening, you will feel more alive than you've ever felt." Thunderous applause. "Let the show begin." With a billow of smoke, Bobby disappeared into a trapdoor. Instantaneously, Robbie appeared on a balcony over the stage, and the crowd went wild. They looked so much like their father had at their age. Mrs. Zander's eyes filled with tears as she watched her boys. No, boy. Tonight they were indistinguishable. With the heavy black eyeliner covering the single tiny freckle under Robbie's eye that allowed her to tell them apart, she could not even follow which was which. They were that identical. In their first public performance, they had truly become one. They had truly become magnificent. The young man on stage sent the audience into delighted giggles as the white mouse disappeared from the small clear box, only to reappear in the pocket on the front of his glittering shirt. Mrs. Zander knew that there were truly 2 white mice, identical in every way, one hidden from the eyes of others at all times, so it appeared to the world that only one existed. It was the oldest trick in the book, one that took grave dedication to execute so seamlessly. Robert would have been proud of them all, she knew. The tears in her eyes spilled over. "And for my last trick," pronounced Robbie, "I will need a volunteer." His words brought a deep silence to the room, followed by a rush of movement as arms all over the theater shot into the air. He looked against the stage lights into the darkness, scanning the front row for his mother's surprised face. "You there," he said, sweeping one arm in the direction of her seat. "Yes, you. Come on up. Ladies and gentlemen, can we give her a hand?" Grudging applause sounded as Mrs. Zander made her way on stage. Robbie could see the confusion in her eyes. This was not part of the act they'd planned. He caught a cordless mic tossed to him by a stagehand. "What is your name, ma'am?" Mrs. Zander blinked at him. "Ladies and gentlemen, it would seem we have a shy volunteer. Can we give her another round of applause?" The crowd cheered loudly, and under the roar, Robbie said, "Play along, Mama. It's all for the sake of the show." When they quieted down, Robbie put the mic to her mouth, and she said, "My name is Marie." "Well, hello, Marie. Thank you for volunteering. For the assurance of our audience, please tell us, do you have any knowledge of the trick we are about to perform?" "No," she said honestly. "All the better," Robbie said, shooting the crowd a conspiratorial grin. They all chuckled with anticipation. "You have lovely legs," he told her, and Mrs. Zander gave him a baffled look, shifting nervously on her feet. Then an assistant wheeled out a large box, roughly the shape of a casket. Robbie centered it on the stage and pulled out an enormous saw with ragged teeth, lifting it to glint in the stage lights. "I hope you aren't overly attached to them." The crowd laughed. Unseen backstage, Bobby mouthed the line with him, timing perfect. Robbie set down the saw and lifted the top of the box upward so the audience could see inside. Their surprise was palpable. They could clearly see that there was no divider inside the box, no second woman curled up in the lower half to put her legs out the opening. "Marie," Robbie asked, lifting out a hand for support, "if you would be so kind." Mrs. Zander eyed the restraints visible at the bottom of the box. "Don't get cold feet now," Robbie said. Again a chuckle from the crowd. Mrs. Zander stepped up and stretched out in the box. Robbie went about fastening the restraints tightly around her shoulders, wrist, waist, and thighs. The silence in the auditorium grew so full that even the back row could hear the rubbing sound of the straps being pulled tight. When Robbie shut the lid, all that stuck out were Mrs. Zander's head and her feet. "Tonight," Robbie declared, "you will see a woman sawed in half." Backstage, Bobby's lips traced the sounds. In the booming applause, Mrs. Zander turned her face toward her son, away from the audience. "I don't know how this works," she whispered. "How do I undo the straps to pull my legs up?" "You must give the people what they want," he told her, smiling. "Something new, something edgy." Mrs. Zander's eyes grew wide as golf balls. "Which half of you wants to be alive today, Mama?" Robbie picked the saw back up and grinned at the crowd. "On 3, he told them. 1. He raised it dramatically over his head. Mrs. Zander looked at the audience with terrified, roving eyes. 2. He lowered it to the notch in the middle of the box. Mrs. Zander thrashed her feet and her head about, trying to break free of her restraints. "Don't worry, Mama," he whispered. "You will be dead, and we'll have a marvelous time." In the wings, Bobby's arms had already begun a sawing motion. 3!
Magic is the mundane with a better press agent. Shortly before I decided to think about being a priest, I spent a lot of time training to be a stage magician in my teens. No, I've never seen Arrested Development. Yes, I own both Now You See Me movies. This will give you a solid read on which side of the "are magicians cool" divide I fall on, and I suspect it's not the same side as Arrested Development. But here's the thing, inside that handful of dust, Behind that flash of light and sudden small avian mammal lies all of human nature, specifically our darkest weakness and our brightest strength. We want to be lied to. We will willingly participate in a campaign of disinformation against ourselves. That's why we love stories. That's why escapism is everyone's drug of choice. It's why magic, when it isn't real, works. Because a magician is a grifter with a big smile, a bigger voice, and a promise. And that promise is, hello, I am going to lie to you for fun. And written inside that promise is, see if you can catch me. It's an inherently adversarial relationship at the same time as a conspiratorial one. We want to be fooled again. We don't want to be fooled again. So we're tugged off our centre balance and exactly where the magician wants us to be. Reality canted a little to the left until suddenly the hat is lifted, the flash goes off, and we see the truth. Or rather, a truth. Although here, even a truth is somewhat messier than most tricks, but that's why this sort of routine, by and large, has fallen away. The trick can never be larger than the magician. The magician can never be larger than the person under the suit or the robe. That's why Tommy Cooper being fed a stepladder from behind the curtain still makes you laugh. It's why David Copperfield is so disarming, even now. It's why I'm not allowed to go to Derren Brown shows alone and early. Because for all those conspiracies, all that willing invitation to disbelief, sometimes it's just magic anyway. Red in tooth and claw when you are unlucky, but it's magic nonetheless. Thanks to both. We rely on you for a lot. Basically, any financial expenditure this company makes is covered by donations, and circumstances have conspired recently to ensure that those expenditures have had to increase. The SFWA have raised the pro-qualifying rate from 6 cents a word to 8 cents a word, and we're not mad at them. No one's mad at them, to be honest, from what I've been able to tell, because 8 cents a word is still far less than what these stories are worth. But 8 cents a word is still 2 cents a word more. And as you can see, 4 weekly shows, that's a lot of words. I asked a scientist. He said it in that voice. That's a lot of words, Alistair. We don't quite have the money to cover it. If you go to our Patreon, which will be linked on the show notes, you'll see we're pretty close, and we've jumped $250 a month the last 3 months to get there. We need your help to get there, not just because it will help us pay these authorial costs, but also it will finally help us to pay our associate editors, also known as slush wranglers. These people are the unsung heroes of the entire industry. If you have ever submitted a story anywhere, you've dealt with a slush wrangler. And if that slush wrangler has come back to you with positive advice, trust me, they didn't have to, and they probably didn't have time to, and they did it anyway. These are the folks that keep the wheels turning everywhere, and it's past time they were rewarded for that. Please, if you can, help us do that. And it's really easy if you can too. Just go to pseudopod.org and click on Feed the Pod, or go to our Patreon and pledge for as little as $5 a month. That will gain you access to our huge vault of exclusive audio, and it will also help us immensely. If you can't donate financially, please consider tweeting a link to an episode, or talking about something you liked, or having us on your show. All that stuff really helps, but we do need all the help we can get with this. So please, folks, if you can, pitch in. Oh, one last thing. If you like stories like this, I can recommend The Prestige, both the novel by Christopher Priest and the movie by Christopher Nolan. The movies The Illusionist and Now You See Me 1 and 2 for very different but no less valid examinations of the magician's art and mindset. And, how best to put this? Honestly, I would argue basically dive into any part of Derren Brown's catalogue. He runs the gamut from magician to illusionist to something else, but it's all really interesting stuff. You won't agree with some of it will disturb you quite aggressively, but he is one of the most articulate performers I've ever seen, and I'd recommend at least trying some of it. However, it's back to The Prestige, Christopher Nolan's, I would argue, truly great film, and Christian Bale's greatest performance, for this week's closing quote. By the way, we will be back next week with The Devil Came to Mamie's on Halloween by Lisa Morton, narrated by Larice White, and audio produced by the magnificent Marty Perrette, as this week has been also. Then, as now, we will be a production of Escape Artists Incorporated, and released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. And I leave you, as I say, with this quote, this glorious piece of language. from the prestige about my favourite art. Now you're looking for the secret, but you won't find it, because, of course, you're not really looking. Have a good week, folks. We'll see you next time.
It's a pseudopod. It's a big foot.
It's all about podcasts these days.